Well, hello, gentlemen.
Hello, Sarah.
So we get the very great privilege of
Honor.
honor of introducing the wonderful, the glorious, we're lucky to have her, Sarah. So thank you. So a little bit of background, Sarah has spent more than 15 years working to connect agriculture and food system stakeholders, the information and networks they need to be successful. She is committed to contributing to a healthy and productive path forward for the food systems and for the past 6 years, Sarah has worked closely with regenerative farmers in her role leading the development and execution of educational experiences at Acres USA. In late 2018, Sarah started Regenerative Food Systems Investments (RFSI) to address a lack of attention, awareness, and capital being given to investment opportunities in regenerative agriculture and food. Before joining Acres USA in late 2016, Sarah spent a decade in agriculture media, where she played a key role in development of successful event and media brands, including Women in Agribusiness, an organic and non-GMO forum, and also served as editor-in-chief of Global AgInvesting Media. Sarah holds a Master's in Science in Agriculture and Resource Economics and a Master's in Science in International Agriculture Development from University of California in Davis. Wow. Awesome job, Sarah. We're so excited to hear what you have to say, and we know that the information you're going to share is going to help kind of create that pathway, because right now it feels like there's a lot of a disconnect on, yeah, I've got this material. Is there anything I can do with it? Is there a market for me? And I hope that you're going to help us find some of those markets. So thank you, Sarah.
Well, that was a pleasure, because usually I get to introduce Steve and Dennis. So thank you, gentlemen, for that. Okay, there's my slides. This is great. Okay, so you guys just got to learn a whole bunch about me, more than you probably wanted to know. I apologize if I repeat any of that in my intro here. But as Steve and Dennis shared, in 2016, after spending 10 years at the intersection of agricultural commodity markets, emerging organic market, or at the time it was an emerging organic market, and agricultural investment, I made a career change and decided to join a company that had just acquired Acres USA. How many of you are familiar with Acres USA? Holler in the chat if you are. If you're not, be sure to check us out at acresusa.com. At Acres USA, we work to bring educational resources to farmers seeking a different path forward, one that doesn't leave them tied to a highly ecologically and economically extractive and intensive way of farming. In 2019, in addition to my role at Acres USA, I started Regenerative Food Systems Investment, or RFSI, because that is a mouthful, with the goal at first of just shining a light on the opportunities to invest in both regenerative farmers and the systems around them, because those are essential to making farmers successful as well. Since then, RFSI has grown our mission and now work to catalyze connections and capital for regenerative food systems. So in 2023, I look forward to continuing to serve Acres USA in an advisory role and put my full attention towards the task of catalyzing a new food systems future with our work at RFSI. And part of that work is really connecting those in the funding community, investments, funders, philanthropic organizations, with farmers and other solution builders, and doing that connecting backwards as well. So solution builders and farmers to our funders. So that brings me to today's presentation, where I've been asked to speak to the market drivers of regenerative agriculture. So without further delay, we will start there. And let's make sure I can advance my slides. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so as John already highlighted today, the current food system is characterized by extraction. And this really does start with the soil. So let's start with some stats. 33% of the Earth's soils are already degraded, and over 90% could become degraded by 2050, according to the FAO. Our most significant non-renewable geo-resource is productive land and fertile soil. But each year, an estimated 24 billion tons of fertile soil are lost due to erosion. That's 3.4 billion tons lost every year. Sorry, I lied. That's 3.4 tons, not billion, lost every year for every person on the planet. And lastly, I want to point out that researchers at the University of Massachusetts recently announced that the rate of soil erosion in Midwestern US is 10 to 1,000 times greater than pre-agricultural erosion rates. So as you can see from this pie chart, agriculture and overgrazing account for more than half of the major causes of soil degradation. So we will dig into that just a little bit more and take a closer look at agricultural soil degradation. This table shows the different types of degradation: physical, chemical, and biological. The types of agriculture activities that cause that, such as overtillage, heavy use of machineries, pesticide use, and depletion of soil organic matter. And finally, at the bottom, we see some of the impacts of this. It's just a partial list, I'm sure, but it includes structural deterioration, reduced water retention, and toxic salt levels, to name just a few. This degradation will eventually have repercussions on the farm in terms of soil health and productivity, and the farm system's ability to withstand weather and climate events. But there are also significant repercussions beyond the soil. So I want to walk through a few of those. As soil and health is degraded on farms across the US, waterways and biodiversity are also impacted. The global food system is the #1 driver of biodiversity loss, with 86% of species at risk. And this map here, you guys have probably seen it many times before, shows the Gulf of Mexico dead zone in 2022 caused by the runoff from farms across the Mississippi River network. The area is one of low oxygen that can kill fish and marine life, and is approximately 3,275 square miles. So it's equivalent to more than 2 million acres of habitat potentially unavailable to fish and bottom species. That's just one enormous example. We also see another implication beyond the soil, and John also alluded to this earlier, and that is human health. 42% of Americans are medically obese, and 50% suffer from at least one chronic condition, largely attributed to the degradation of our food system and eating habits over the past several decades. This costs us not only in health, but also in dollars and cents. In 2019, American consumers spent an estimated $1.1 trillion on food. That price tag includes the cost of producing, processing, retailing, wholesaling food that we buy and eat, but it does not include the cost of healthcare for millions who fall ill with diet-related diseases. It does not include the present and future costs of the food system's contributions to water and air pollution, reduced biodiversity, or greenhouse gas emissions, which cause climate change. So taking those into account, a Rockefeller report shows that the true cost of the US food system is at least 3 times as big, $3.2 trillion per year. And we're not done yet, because finally, beyond these implications, there are implications of our extractive food system on climate. So as soil is degraded and vegetation is reduced, carbon is released, and our soil can no longer serve as the carbon sink that it has the potential to be. And moreover, the predominant way of agriculture today is a huge driver of greenhouse gas emissions. We'll talk a little bit about that later today, but you can see how this happens in the chart on the screen. So not to be completely depressing, but that is a pretty dismal outlook on our current agriculture and food system as it is today. But regenerative agriculture at scale has an answer to almost all of these challenges to the current system. The positives associated with regenerative agriculture, the regenerative agricultural way of farming, include agronomic, operational, environmental, consumer, and climatic and ecosystems level benefits that you can see here. For the sake of time, I won't go through all of them, but you can see these ultimately address the extraction and degradation I just outlined and lead to resilience and regeneration at many, many levels. Okay, I think I just skipped a slide, but yeah. Okay, if regenerative holds all of these answers, and that is my claim, when will we see it scale, and how big is regenerative today? Well, it's hard to say for sure because there's very little historical data, but I'm going to share a little bit about what we do know. and on a little bit on historical growth. So because there is no doubt that regenerative has grown in the last 5 to 10 years, here are some of the indications. Using certified organic as one proxy, we see that from 2011 to 2019, certified organic cropland grew 74%, pastureland and rangeland grew 22%, and certified organic operations grew 80%. If you want to use cover crops, one but certainly not the only regenerative practice, as a proxy, we see a steady increase as well. The most recent SARE CTIC National Cover Crop Survey similarly found a steady increase in the average acreage planted to cover crops per farm between 2015 and 2019, a 40% increase for that period on average, and that's that chart on the right of your screen. Okay, and because RFSI is all about investment, we watch the investment trends in the space. And in the past 10 years, we have seen significant increase in venture capital investment, as seen here in this chart, and other types of investment and funding into the regenerative agriculture space. So some definite historical momentum on many fronts. So that brings us to today. Sustainable Markets Initiative report estimates that 15% of farmland globally is cared for using regenerative practices. However, in the US, it is estimated by Rodale Institute and others that only approximately 1 to 1.5% of farmland is farmed regeneratively. Beyond farmland, there is a whole market for regenerative agriculture that includes the businesses that support the transition, such as biological companies and other service providers. And its value in 2022 is estimated at 8.7 billion US dollars by some market research companies. I think that is actually missing a lot of the tangential businesses involved in the space, and that this could be a whole lot larger of a market. So regenerative agriculture, the regenerative agriculture market measured as not only agricultural products, but also markets for biological tools and other technologies for transition, is anticipated to reach $16.8 billion in 2027. I also think this might be an underestimate, but that would be a calculated annual growth rate of 14% in value. And I'll just note that the North American region is projected to be the largest market share for regenerative agriculture during this period to 2027. Okay, so that was a little bit of background of where the market is, and I wanted to spend most of the rest of this session talking about what I call the headwinds and the tailwinds facing the future of the regenerative agriculture space. That is the things that will drive the space forward and those things that may slow it down, and a little bit at the end about how we can address this. So we'll start with the drivers or tailwinds, and we'll explore first those factors that are pushing farmers and other stakeholders away from the conventional way of doing things. And these include, you can see them in orange there, farm economics, rising climate risk, on-farm health and safety concerns, and environmental concerns. Then on the flip side, there are also pull factors, and these are those factors that I see pulling farmers and the sector at large toward the regenerative space. So pull factors that we'll look at include growing consumer demand, corporate commitments, and favorable long-term economics. So let's get started with these drivers. So on-farm economics and commodity systems are becoming even more strained as razor-thin margins are exacerbated. These maps show the decline in net farm incomes over the past 5 decades. For those of you who can't see it clearly, it is tiny on my screen. The red represents net farm incomes of less than $0. And as you can see in 2019, which is the map on the right, there are a whole lot more red areas than in 1969. The map on the left. So why are farmers making less? Number one reason, according to the USDA, rising input costs. Over the last 70 years, labor and land inputs declined 76 and 28% respectively. They declined. Meanwhile, the use of other intermediate goods, including energy, fertilizer, pesticides, purchase services, seeds, and feed have increased 133%. Another reason is low returns on production. The simplification of farm operations or lack of diversity can leave operations overexposed to market fluctuations and decrease livelihood resilience. We see this a lot in our space. And then finally, land access and unprecedented farm debt are also contributing factors here. So sticking with the acknowledgement that farmers are operating on thin margins, low commodity prices combined with rising input costs led to stagnation or decline in overall farm profitability in 2019. And then rising input prices in particular continued to impact profitability in 2021 and 22. You can see here on the chart input prices in 2021, 22, and 23. So far this year, you'll see that prices have decreased a little bit in the first few weeks, but that's that little red line that's just starting to go down, but prices remain far above 5-year averages. And in December, the University of Illinois crop budget estimated that there will be higher corn and soybean prices in 2023 compared to their August forecast, but explained that 2023's farm returns are still expected to slip below levels experienced in 21 and 22, due in large part to these record high input costs. Okay, so another tailwind, a push factor. Another factor pushing farmers to explore new farming systems is increasing climate risk. So what is climate risk? Two examples for farmers include increasing temperatures and increasing precipitation. A 2021 study out of Stanford showed that climate-fueled temperature increases generated an estimated $27 billion in insurance payments to farmers between 1991 and 2017. Those losses accounted for nearly 20% of the program's total payouts over that period. Regenerative practices offer an answer to some of these risks in the form of increased systems resilience. For example, better water absorption and retention in healthy soils. And for those of you who have been following the news, you can see an example of this just happening in California last month with all the rain they got on that bottom headline there on the screen. Okay, yet another factor pushing the market to search for new ag systems. While data is increasingly showing the damaging impact of chemical inputs in depleted soils on human health, safety, and nutrition, as well as environmental health, farmers are seeing it and feeling it firsthand. I'm sure many of you in the audience are experiencing this. And anecdotally, I can't tell you how many farmers I have met that tell me the reason they converted to regenerative practices was because of their concerns for human and environmental impacts of chemical agriculture. Last week, RFSI spoke with a UK farmer who made the conversion to organic and then to regenerative way back in 2005. And his 3 reasons for transitioning were conventional economics didn't make sense anymore. Number 2 was he had witnessed the decimation of a bird population as a result of chemicals used on farm to treat aphids. And then the third one was the realization that the grains grown on their farm and treated with Roundup were making it into food and human consumption within as little as 10 days. This farmer is not alone in all of these experiences, and I think this is increasingly pushing people elsewhere. Okay. So those were some of those push factors I was talking about. They're pushing people towards something new. There's also these tailwinds that are pulling people in a certain direction, and that's towards regeneration. The first one that I want to talk about is consumer demand, and this is a big one. So given that I spend 24/7 working in the regenerative space, it always surprises me when I'm reminded that regenerative agriculture is still a term that many consumers do not know. In 2021, only 16% of consumers aged 16 to 44 were aware of regenerative agriculture. But the number is growing because despite low awareness of the term, regenerative food systems encompass many of the things that consumers are searching for right now. Consumers today are increasingly seeking to understand where their food comes from and how it was produced. They want their food to also be a reflection of their values. And today that means good for people and planet. That means they want safe, chemical-free, and nutritious foods. They also want to know about and reduce the climate impact of the food and fibers they consume. So traceability is of increasing importance. These consumers' desire to continue to influence purchasing decisions, and Planet Forward explains that 55% of all growth in CPG came from sustainably marketed products from 2015 to 2019. Consumers will pay 39% in premiums for sustainably marketed products compared to conventionally marketed counterparts. And 69% of consumers have changed the products they use due to concern about climate change. This building demand is pulling on producers to change the way they produce food and fiber products, but producers are not the only ones that are being pulled. So companies of all sizes are also being encouraged by consumer demand to change the products they produce and sell. And this is increasing demand from corporates, is in turn driving the market forward. So growing commitments from nations and multinational CPG companies reflect growing awareness of the critical role regenerative agriculture plays. G20 nations have pledged to restore 1 billion hectares of degraded land by 2030, according to the United Nations. And at the same time, in 2021, the number of multinationals making corporate commitments to incorporating regenerative agriculture into their supply chains has taken off, with JBS, Mars, Nestle, PepsiCo, Walmart, as noted by John earlier, and others joining earlier adopters like Danone and General Mills. And in 2022, we saw even more of these commitments. These all point to the growing awareness of the global imperative for agriculture and food to shift from a contributor to a solution to environmental degradation, climate, human health, and more. This desire for companies and food companies in particular to make commitments to regenerative is driven by at least two major factors. The first is this increasing demand from consumers for the attributes that regenerative ingredients and foods represent, as discussed already, but that therefore results in a need to secure supply from regenerative farmers. The second is the necessity to address Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that are not directly from a company, but are tied to them in their value or supply chain. In the food system, these emissions account for more than 90% of packaged food companies' total emissions on average. So as public and private pressure mounts to clean up climate impacts in companies, food companies can't stay idle. By addressing their agricultural and food supply chains and applying more regenerative systems, these companies can make significant strides. Finally, the last driver to cover is favorable economics in regenerative. But in order for farmers to even consider a change in production practice or system, the economics must make sense. So is regenerative agriculture profitable? Do the economics make sense? And can this be a driver for the regenerative agricultural market? The short answer is yes, but in the longer term. So let's dig into that just a little bit. Regenerative agriculture systems can lead to better economic outcomes in three primary ways: by cutting input costs, by growing diverse and higher value crops and accessing new markets that reward the attributes of regenerative products, and by creating more systems resilience. For example, soil life and water holding capacity that help the system withstand volatile and potentially costly weather and climate risks. I shared this chart last year, but I really love it, so I'm sharing it again. And it highlights a 2018 Lundgren and Lacan study that shares some of these outcomes. And it compares the revenue and costs of conventional and regenerative production systems. So the heights of the bars represent the average gross profits from 40 fields in each treatment. Profit was calculated using direct costs and revenues for each field and excludes any overhead and indirect expenses. And regenerative cornfields implemented 3 or more practices, such as planting a multi-species cover crop, eliminating pesticide use, abandoning tillage, and integrating livestock onto the crop ground. Conventional cornfields used fewer than 2 of these practices. So the regenerative systems had 70% higher profit than conventional. So that's the regenerative is on the right. And the specific to input costs, you can see that corn seed costs and irrigation costs, which are represented in orange and green, went down, and fertilizer costs, the tan color in the middle, went down significantly. So these outcomes are awesome. I love to share them. And while they are completely within reach and done right, they are not often immediate. So the caveat to favorable economic outcomes for regenerative is that there is a period of transition where farmers may face an initial loss. A study in Canada conducted by Bain & Company with Nature United showed that while beginning the process of changing farming techniques, in this case crop rotation, cover crops, reduced tillage, and nutrient management, initial yields will be lower, leading to less marketable produce and less profit. The study suggests that it would take about 4 years until the farmer would break even and make the same amount they would have before transitioning. However, the rewards are greater after the 4th year with higher profits than the farm would have made before the transition. So lots of upside, again, long-term favorable economics. And that wraps up the drivers or tailwinds moving our system toward regenerative. So these are all the things that I think are going to push people towards regenerative and push the market forward, primarily from a production side. I think now is time to talk about some of the headwinds, or the barriers that could potentially slow the expansion of regenerative agriculture. I've listed several here that I will briefly review. And I'm going to start with farmer adoption. While there are many, many reasons to transition, there are also still significant barriers and risks to adopting approaches and implementing entirely new systems. And I think both Rick and John spoke to the idea that farmers are being asked to bear a lot of risk. And so the more we can address the risks of adoption, the better off the entire market is to grow. So let me just talk about 4 barriers that really resonate with the communities that I've worked with. The first is behavior and cultural change. So in other words, the idea that changing away from the predominant paradigm and mindset is difficult. The second is trusted technical assistance. Farmers and ranchers are extraordinarily busy people, you all should know, managing complex businesses in a risky and low margin and ever-changing business environment. So this reality makes taking the time to learn about and experiment with new management practices a slow and time-consuming process. So that trusted technical assistance can be a barrier. I will pause here and say kudos to all of you for being here at this event to learn, because it is part of the process. So kudos to you all. Barrier 3, financial capital and incentives. One of the biggest barriers to farmers actually adopting regenerative techniques is the added costs and risks in changing any given practice, which we just talked about. So even if regenerative can actually lead to better economic outcomes, the initial risk during the process of change, when transition costs are highest and when premiums are not yet attainable, can serve as a deterrent. And 4, under this idea of farmer adoption barriers, regenerative supply chains. And John mentioned this already, and I won't go into too much detail, but one of the biggest barriers to farmers actually adopting regenerative techniques is the added costs and risks in changing any given practice. But if there is not a market for them to bring their product to, or there is not a premium for them to attain at the end of that, then the incentive for them to transition is not there. So the idea, following on what John said, is if we could have the supply chain take on some of that risk as well and share in building regeneration together, that'd be extremely helpful to that barrier. I will now skip down to the next barriers and just kind of run through them very quickly. And again, maybe I shouldn't call them barriers. Maybe they are just what I said, which is headwinds. These are things that could potentially slow down the growth of a market that is charging forward. So global economics trends is the next one. So increasing interest rates, food inflation, and other repercussions of the current economic climate may deter or slow consumer adoption of regenerative foods that tend to be higher priced. It can make it harder for farmers to pay down debt and therefore less willing to take on more financial risk in trying new things. And it may slow overall financial investment in the space by various stakeholders. Other barriers include that there is no universal definition of regenerative agriculture, which in some ways is intentional and serves the space well, but it also serves as a barrier to things like defining a regenerative premium and can cause confusion amongst consumers as they try to sort through the many, many different claims for healthy food these days. A lack of definition is also contributing to another impediment to market growth, and that is greenwashing, the act of conveying a false impression or misleading information about how a company's or a farm's products are environmentally sound. And lastly, and we could talk about this all day, and I won't, but maybe someday, US policies from crop insurance to subsidies have been working for decades to support an extractive and inefficient system of agricultural production. Until this changes, those seeking to farm regeneratively will always be at some disadvantage. So those were the headwinds, some of the headwinds I've identified. I'm going to, for the sake of this audience, and because farmers and land are the foundation to the entire regenerative system, I'm going to dig into that first headwind again. So addressing some of those farmer adoption barriers just a little bit more. If we can address these barriers, momentum at the farm level will be unleashed. Addressing barriers to adoption is much more complex than what we can cover here and what we have time for, but starting to address these will offer a much easier pathway to transition for many. So that first one was that cultural barrier, creating, and the solution to that, creating community that supports a shifts to new ways of thinking about farming is important. The difficulty and complexity involved in doing things differently. And I mean that from both a mental and a physical standpoint and from a practices standpoint. The way things have been done for decades, it's hard to measure that difficulty. But we have heard over and over that the value of farmers being connected to other farmers who are doing things similarly is immeasurable. So that's why, again, events like today are so important. Make sure that you're connecting with as many of our speakers and as many of your fellow farmers as possible so that you can explore this journey forward together. Addressing technical assistance is also important to support new approaches and systems. It's essential. The companies that are producing this event today offer training programs, consulting services, events like this, and can also probably support peer-to-peer connections. And so this reduces both the burden and the risk of learning to do things differently alone. Thirdly, we talked earlier about the financial risk during transition to regenerative. We've talked quite a bit about that. There is a period of years, and it varies, where producers are at more financial risk for a multitude of reasons. For example, the process of building soil and systems health and resilience, planting new crops, waiting for market premiums. There are few financial tools to support this period right now, especially as producers move away from convention that most financial and policy tools are built around. So to enable adoption, we must build financial instruments to encourage, to support farmers during their riskier transition period. Whether these are grants to encourage pilot projects or patient long-term loans or something else, we need to build these and continue to build more of them. And finally, again, I haven't talked much about this, but if farmers are to transition, they need markets to sell their regenerative products into. These markets and the supply chains that carry products to consumers need to be able to preserve the integrity of regenerative and ultimately secure a fair price that allows farmers to be rewarded for their work. Much more attention needs to be put here so that there's a secure place for farmers to bring their product. That was a lot, I know, but I promise you we are almost there. So to wrap this up, and as I conclude this presentation, I want to bring into focus what my company, Regenerative Food Systems Investment, or RFSI, thinks about and works on every day. The keys that we think will unlock market growth for regenerative agriculture and food systems. These are some of the things when looking at this entire picture we painted today of the significant drivers of regenerative agriculture and the headwinds that we think will accelerate the expansion of regeneration. And the good news, it's already starting to happen. Okay, so the first, and I'm going to start over on the upper left, is research. Understanding our soils, the role of regenerative practices and the way it all connects to things like ecological and human health outcomes is essential to moving regenerative from fringe to mainstream agriculture. Moreover, better understanding the connection between agricultural practices and human health and nutrition outcomes, which is the topic of an increasing body of work by organizations such as the Bionutrient Food Association, could potentially play a key role in driving increased consumer and industry demand for regeneratively produced products. Second is innovation. We already see how tools like biologicals and rotational grazing technologies are enabling transition to more regenerative practices, but the role of innovation goes beyond the farm. Technology can also play an important role in building transparent and traceable supply chains and connecting regenerative farmers to consumers, among many other things. Thirdly, policy. As mentioned earlier, for the most part, policy in the US has served to perpetuate the status quo, not only by incentivizing extractive agricultural systems, but also by disincentivizing movement away from these systems. A shift in policy that recognizes this dilemma and the broad impact it has on farmers and food systems will go a long way in creating change. This was starkly clear last week at our RFSI Europe event when, again, UK farmer Charles Hunter Smart explained the significant role that policy played in encouraging him to transition to organic and regenerative way back in 2005. Luckily, we have seen shifts in policy in just the past 12 to 24 months, and there are organizations working hard to change policies, including Landcorps and the Kiss the Ground-led Regenerate America campaign. And lastly, that brings us back to capital. At RFSI, we focus on capital and capital investment and funding of regenerative food system because capital and access to it is a leading barrier to adoption of new systems. Capital can serve to reduce risk for farmers and other project executors and can unlock innovation in new tools, services, markets, and financial instruments. Capital that will enable and expand regenerative agriculture and food systems is needed in many forms: grants, loans, and equity investments, and from many sources: philanthropic funders, regional and national government, and venture capital and private equity and impact investors. The list goes on, and into many things, including land, farmers, innovation, research, and policy. So those are the four key things that we think will drive this system forward and help grow the market. The beautiful thing about these four keys to unlocking barriers and moving the market forward is that they don't work in silos. Research feeds into innovation and policy. Capital feeds into research and innovation, and policy can influence all three of these. These are huge undertakings, but the regenerative agriculture market has enormous tailwinds moving it forward right now. We just need to continue to address the headwinds that may slow it down and feed these keys. It's happening. It's part of the regen revolution. We just need more of it. So that was a super, super fast presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions. If I have time, I will check my documents here right now. Let's see if you guys fed me any questions. Oh my goodness, lots of questions. Okay. I'm going to read through some of these, and I'm sorry if it's a little wonky as I read through some of them. Are other countries ahead of the US? What can we learn from them and implement? I think that is super interesting. RFSI has done work with the Australian market and is just starting to work with the European markets. And it's as though we're ahead in some respects and behind in others. So if I compare us to the EU or Europe, we are far behind in policy. Which I think is really interesting because I always saw that as a detriment. But I was speaking to somebody earlier this week, and he said, yes, you are behind us. This man was from the UK. You are behind us in policy, but what it shows is that your market will develop without the policy support. So I thought that was a really interesting comment on his part. I think we are ahead in terms of financing the space and funding the space from a non-public standpoint, from private investors. So I think that also can be potentially good. And from regenerative ag practices standpoint, I think let's save that question for the end. I'd like to hear what John has to say about that. How's that? Okay. Let's see if I can answer this one. I'm going to read it out loud. Barrier to farmer adoption is regen premiums based on yields during transition years and beyond, especially if yields don't stabilize for a while due to learning curves, weather conditions. Is regen premiums based on yields during transition years and beyond? I think that's the question. I will say, I don't know if I'm going to answer this question directly, but there are programs right now, increasing number of programs and financial vehicles that are working to address the premiums don't exist because you have not either proved that you are fully transitioned over, or because you haven't found the right market to take that good. There are organizations right now working to say, we're going to give you a higher price for that transition period, maybe not the full premium, but partial premiums, or we're going to give you a better kind of financing to reduce that risk during that period. Maybe you don't have to pay back your loans until after you've started realizing premiums. Are grants and other funds readily available? That is a really good question. We work with some communities in the philanthropic space, and there are a lot of people really interested in funding the farmer. I think the hard part right now, and this is where RFSI would like to step up and play a bigger role, is connecting the farmers to that capital. I think that money is only increasing the philanthropic capital. It's only increasing to this space, but aligning the scale of the capital with the scale of the project and the farm and directly to the farmers who need it is the challenging part for us right now. It's like the supply chain. We need to develop the supply chain between there.